So I walk into Sephora this weekend and I track down the sales rep and I tell him that it's my first time buying makeup and that I wanted a matte lipstick. So he brings me to the lipstick section and does a couple of swatches on his hand, and I picked out this lip color. He probably thought that I was crazy and then said, "Oh wow, that's a really intense color for your first time buying makeup." Hey everyone, so in this series we'll be doing tons of fun Apache configuration things. So in part 1, the first thing that we'll be talking about is configuring Apache server as a web server. We'll be looking at things like SSL termination, as well as things like virtual hosting and things like that. So it's a lot of fun. We'll also be playing around with Docker Compose and Docker containers so that you can learn more about it.
So let's go ahead and do an outline of what will be going on in our part 1 of configuring Apache. So we'll be talking about what a web server is. We'll talk about how to configure an Apache web server. And we'll also be talking about a cool feature of Apache called virtual hosting and how to set up configuration files for your virtual hosts. So what is a web server? I just want to highlight that this overview is super basic, maybe a little bit too basic, but I will be going more into internet layers and how DNS resolution and like what happens when you hit a web page and things like that in a later series in the future. But right, so what is a web server? I'm going to go ahead and draw some pictures. Here we have an Apache web server. And then we are going to have some files right here that are loaded onto our web server. I'm going to draw this in a large box. And then we're going to wrap this in a large box, and then also this one. So here we have our web server, and the goal is to be able to serve these files right here to whoever's requesting those files. So here I have me right here. And what I will be doing is making an HTTP request for these files right here. And then the Apache web server will go, okay, I'm going to give these files back to her in a HTTP response. And that's it. That's all a web server is. Here I am the client. And here, this is the server. So we have a client-server relationship. And that's the basics of what it is. Now, in the middle, we can either go over the internet to deliver these responses. So I can be like, hey, I want to hit an endpoint like www.example.com, and then that will resolve, and the Apache web server will then deliver my files back to me. But I will be going through that again in another web series in the future. Okay, so before we actually start looking at our terminal or any configuration files, let's actually draw pictures of what we're trying to do. So here again, I have my Apache web server. Let's do Apache web server. And then what I have is a directory called /var/www/html. And this directory is important because this is where I want to put, a web application or any sort of files that I want to serve up. And this is just an Apache convention where if your Apache web server is a web server, then you have to load up your files underneath this path. And all I will be doing is loading up either a index.html file or an index.php file. Again, this is Apache convention. Your entry point to your web application needs to be called either index.html or index.php. Let me wrap this inside a box again. Okay, so this is all inside our Apache web server. And then what I will be doing is exposing a port 80. And what will happen is if we hit something like, our IP address that this is on, and then port 80, we should see whatever is written inside our HTML file or PHP file. So all I will be doing is serving up something like hello world. And I won't be writing out a full web application just because I want to focus on the Apache web server. And all of this will be launched from a Docker container as well. So let's go ahead and figure out how to do all of that. So now that we know our general goal, we can go ahead and start opening our terminal and looking at some configuration files. So here I will be using Docker Compose to configure our container. Our Apache web server will be launched from a Docker container. And the reason I'm using Docker Compose instead of just the Docker command line tool is because I find it easier to understand what's going on when everything is laid out in front of you. So here in our Docker Compose file, let's do a breakdown. We're using version 2 of Docker Compose. We have a service defined and we named it Apache. And in this service, it will be pulling the image PHP 7.1.3 Apache and have the following port mappings. So on the left, you will see port 80 on the host is mapped onto port 80 on the container. I'm going to change the exposed port to port 81 just to sort of illustrate a point that when I change that to 81, we will be accessing whatever is being served on port 81 of our host. So here, let's go ahead and do docker-compose up. I'm in my demo folder and it will detect the Docker Compose file inside this directory and press enter. So it's starting our Apache container. And I am going to go ahead and hit that endpoint. So I'm serving it. Our host machine is localhost. We're going to hit port 81. And oh my goodness, it says it's forbidden. You don't have permission to access / on this server. Why is this happening? So the reason this is happening is because we haven't actually populated /var/www/html on our Apache web server yet. So there's nothing for it to serve. I'm going to go ahead and X this out. Now we're going to go ahead and look at our Docker images so that we can go inside our Docker container to be able to kind of finick around with it. So this one we can tell is our Apache container. It says PHP 7.1.3, which is the image we have on the left, and it's been up for 51 seconds. So I'm going to copy this container ID. Let's do a clear. And then I'm going to do docker exec-it, paste that image, and then we're going to open up bash, and let's hit enter. Awesome, now we're inside our Docker container with the Apache image installed onto it. And now I'm going to do echo and a hello world into index.html. So before I press enter, you'll notice that we're in /var/www/html. And this line will just basically put hello world into index.html. Let's press enter. Let's do a cat index.html just to double check to make sure we actually did what we thought we were going to do. Great, inside index.html, it just says hello world. Now let's go ahead and look at localhost once more again on port 81 and see if there's any changes. So localhost 81, press enter. Great, awesome. It says hello world. So we know that now our server is serving something. So one of the cooler features that Apache has is virtual hosting. Let's first talk about what virtual hosting is. So we have a Apache web server here. Draw my little picture. And I'm going to draw a box around that to represent my Apache web server. As we saw before, under various directories, we can put our different web applications under them and serve that web application. So what virtual hosting allows us to do is serve different web applications from the same web server. So let's say on the right here we have test1.com, and then we have test2.com and test3.com. Apache can serve all three of these. So what will happen is that these requests will come in. Let's do a different request for these different websites, all to the same IP address, and then it'll resolve to whatever website that you indicated in your URL. Now, Apache, for their web server configuration, they have different types of configurations. For instance, you can host each of these on a different IP and different ports and things like that, and I'll link down below that sort of documentation. So now let's actually get to configuring our virtual hosts. So like before, we have our same Docker Compose file. We're pulling the PHP Apache image, and we are exposing our host port 80 onto our container port 80. So let's do a docker-compose up. And let's do a docker ps to see what containers are running. We're going to copy that Docker container ID, and we're going to do a docker exec-it our container ID, and we're going to run bash. Awesome. So now we are inside our Apache container. So before we actually do any sort of configuration, let's actually see what was happening previously to have our index.html file being served. So here we can see that we are under the directory /var/www/html. Now this is a new Apache server, so there's nothing under here, but previously we had index.html. So now we are going to look at the virtual host configuration file. So there's a default that Apache comes with, and that is /etc/apache2 /sites enabled, and sorry, let me do a cat of that. Cat sites enabled, and then this is what we are given as the default virtual host configuration file. So this is the important part. We can see that under document root we have /var/www/html. So what this means is that anything under this directory will be served, and we're mapping onto port 80. So let me do a clear screen, and I'm going to cd up a directory. So this is under /var/www is where all the web apps, or in our case static HTML pages, live under. So let's do a make dir test1, a make dir test2. So we want to serve two different HTML pages based on whatever endpoints that we have. So I'm actually going to install Vim to make my text editing a bit easier. So apt-get update. And now let's do an apt-get install -y flag Vim. Let me do a clear screen, and then I'm going to cd into test1. And let's do what we did before, and we're going to make a index.html page. And so here we're going to say, this is test1, and do wq. And then let's cd into /var/www/test2. And we're going to vim index.html. And then we're going to say, this is test2. Cool. Now let's actually go ahead and start finagling with our configuration file. So as we remember, it lives under /etc/apache2 /sites available. And let's do an ls to see what's under here. So we have two configuration files. I'm going to copy the contents of the default one into, let's call this test.conf, so that we have some sort of baseline to work with. And now we're going to edit test.conf. So let's go ahead and do that. So vim test.conf. And I'm going to go ahead and delete some of these lines, these comment lines that are kind of annoying to be able to see anything. By the way, the shortcut for this in Vim is just tap DD. Oops, I accidentally deleted something I didn't want to delete. Let me go ahead and put that back in. /virtual-host end tag. Oops, end tag. Okay. So here, what we want to do now is we have two new document roots, right? So if you remember, we have test1, and we're going to add two new things. We're going to call, it's called server name, and we're going to call this test1.com. And then we also have server alias that we're going to say is www.test1.com. And so this allows us to hit test1.com, and test1.com will point to our Apache server and then resolve to whatever is under our document root here. Okay, so if we recall, we also have something called test2. So let's go ahead and copy this because it's going to be the exact same thing, and paste it under here. And paste that and change these appropriate things to test2.com, test2.com, oops, test2.com. Awesome. So now we have two virtual hosts with two different document roots, which if we hit www.test2.com, it should resolve to the appropriate document root. And these are all running under port 80. So let's save that. Now what we want to do is go ahead and enable this configuration file as well as disabling what was previously there. So we're going to do a2 insights test.conf. That will enable our new configuration file. And we want to do a2 dsite 000-default.conf, and this will disable the old configuration file. And to double check that this has happened, let's go ahead and ls/etc/apache2 sites enabled. And under here, we can see that test.conf has replaced what was previously there, which was 000-default.conf. And let's do a service Apache reload and do what it says to do. Awesome. So we've reloaded our Apache to Webserver in order to pick up the changes to our configuration file. Now, Because I don't actually own test1.com or test2.com to be able to configure the various IP resolutions, we are going to instead do a hack on my host machine to tell it to point to my Apache container that's running locally. So I'm going to do a new tab, and here, this is my host machine. So previously, in my other two tabs, I was in my Apache container. Now we're back onto my host machine, which is my Mac laptop, okay? So we are going to do vim, we're going to do a sudo vim so that I have writing access, /etc/hosts. I believe I already have it written down here because I was doing some testing before. I'm going to enter my password. Cool. So here, these two lines I've already added, and 0.0.0.0 is what my IP address of my Apache server appears as on my host. And the way that I figured this out was I did a Docker inspect onto the container ID that my Apache server is running under. And then here I have test1.com, and then here I have test2.com. So what will happen is test1.com, when I hit that in my URL, it will point to 0.0.0.0.0, and then my Apache web server will then go ahead and resolve the different document routes based on the URL that I have. So let's escape out of here. Going to open a new URL window to double check that this is happening. So let's do test1.com, and my expectation is that it will say this is test1. Great, it did. And let's go ahead and test out test2.com. So once again, my expectation is that it'll then hit test2. It'll then say this is test2. So test2.com. Nope, I misspelled that. Sorry about that. So I'm going to say test2.com. Awesome, and it says this is test2. So to summarize, we have launched two web applications or static web pages from the same Apache web server. Next week in part 2 of Configuring Apache, we'll also be talking about what is an SSL certificate, as well as how to enable SSL termination for an Apache web server.
Thank you so much for watching, and once again, if you enjoyed what you watched, please hit the subscribe button, as well as follow me on my various social media pages. All my handles are the Amy code for Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'll link all the links down below.